The rain was coming down in sheets, turning the driveway into a glistening mirror of slick pavement. Jake sat by the window watching the storm roll in. The rhythmic tapping of raindrops against the glass was oddly soothing, until a sharp, deliberate knock at the door shattered the moment. He wheeled himself over, already dreading what he knew was coming. Opening the door, he was met with the sight of her. Karen stood there, prim as ever in a navy blue blazer and a too-tight pencil skirt, clutching a clipboard like it was a weapon. Her perfectly manicured nails tapped against the paperwork as she forced a saccharine smile. The expression didn't reach her eyes. "Evening, Jacob," she chirped, voice dripping with the kind of false sweetness that made his stomach churn. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything too important." Jake knew better than to correct her on the name. She always insisted on calling him Jacob, despite knowing he hated it. He simply raised a brow. Karen didn't wait for an invitation, stepping forward just enough for the scent of overpowering floral perfume to invade his space. She dramatically flipped a page on her clipboard before pressing it against his chest. "You've been issued a formal violation notice. Your ramp is not in compliance with HOA aesthetics, and you have 1 week to remove it. Failure to do so will result in a fine of $500. Jake barely glanced at the paper before exhaling slowly, reining in the irritation bubbling inside him. "This ramp is the only way I can get in and out of my house," he said evenly. "It's not optional." Karen's smile tightened. "That may be, but we have rules for a reason. This," she gestured toward the sturdy wooden ramp leading up to his front door, "is an eyesore. It disrupts the neighborhood's uniformity." Jake felt a sharp pang of anger, but he kept his expression neutral. His grandpa had built that ramp with his own hands, carefully measuring every angle, ensuring it was structurally sound and fully ADA compliant. It wasn't some slapped-together piece of junk, it was a necessity. "I don't need HOA approval for a medical accommodation," he said, watching for a flicker of doubt in her face. Instead, Karen's smirk widened. "That's where you're wrong. Our bylaws clearly state that any exterior modification must be approved by the board. And I am the board." Jake clenched his jaw. "The ADA is federal law. It overrides your little rulebook." Karen sighed, flipping to another page. "I don't make the rules, Jacob. I enforce them." She tapped the fine amount with a polished nail. "And if you don't comply, the fine doubles." Lightning flashed behind her, briefly illuminating the smug satisfaction on her face. Jake's fingers tightened on the armrests of his wheelchair. He wasn't naive, he knew exactly what this was. Karen didn't care about uniformity. She cared about control. She had been a thorn in his side since he moved into the neighborhood 2 years ago, always finding some new reason to complain. The color of his door, his recycling bins not being tucked away fast enough, the inappropriate placement of his welcome mat. And now this. "You do realize what you're doing is illegal, right?" His voice was calm, but there was steel underneath. Karen let out a condescending laugh. "Oh honey, that's cute." She stepped back, shaking her head as though he were a misbehaving child. "If you have a real complaint, feel free to take it up with the board." "Oh wait, that's me." Jake stared at her, resisting the urge to tell her exactly where she could shove that clipboard. He could see his neighbor, Mr. Reeves, watching from his porch across the street. The old man met his eyes but quickly looked away, choosing to pretend he hadn't seen anything. Typical. No one ever stood up to Karen. The rain picked up, sending a gust of wind between them. Karen wrinkled her nose, glancing at the sky before giving a mockingly sympathetic sigh. "Do yourself a favor, Jacob. Just take it down. It's not worth the trouble." She turned on her heel and strutted back toward her house, heels clicking against the wet pavement. Jake watched her go, his heart pounding with frustration. He looked down at the violation notice still clutched in his hand. $500. For the crime of existing in his own home the way he needed to. His fingers curled around the paper, crumpling it. This wasn't over. Later that evening, Jake sat at the kitchen table, staring at the fine notice while his grandfather, Ron, leaned over his shoulder. The old man let out a low whistle. $500, huh? She really thinks she's got you. Jake rubbed his temples. "It doubles if I don't take it down." Grandpa Ron scoffed. "She can fine you all she wants. Won't make it legal." Jake sighed. "I know that, but you think she cares? She just wants to make my life hell." Ron folded his arms, his weathered face thoughtful. "This ramp is built to code. I made damn sure of that." "I know." Jake exhaled, tapping the edge of the notice. "But the HOA?" "Forget the HOA." Ron's voice was firm. "Karen thinks she's the queen of this neighborhood. But last I checked, she doesn't outrank city law." Jake glanced up. Ron's lips curled into a slow, knowing grin. I built my first accessibility ramp before that woman was out of diapers, he said. And I happen to have a few friends in very useful places. Jake felt the first stirrings of hope. You think you can do something? Ron patted his shoulder. Oh, Kit, I know I can. A knock at the door interrupted them. Jake turned his wheelchair and rolled over, expecting another unwanted visitor. But this time when he opened the door, it wasn't Karen. It was a courier. Delivery for Jacob Carter, the man said, handing over a crisp envelope. Jake took it hesitantly, thanking the courier before shutting the door. He glanced at Ron before carefully tearing open the envelope. Inside was another letter. Not from Karen but from the HOA itself. And this one wasn't just a fine. It was a final warning. Jake's stomach twisted as he scanned the bold print. Failure to comply within 48 hours will result in legal action. Ron took one look at his grandson's face and let out a slow, humorless chuckle. Well, he said, cracking his knuckles. Guess it's time to make a few phone calls. Jake looked back down at the letter, his jaw tightening. Karen had just made the worst mistake of her life. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting sharp lines across the kitchen table. Jake sat staring at the HOA's letter, his fingers tightening around the paper as if he could crush it into nothingness. Legal action. Karen wasn't just playing games anymore, she was pushing for a fight. Across from him, Grandpa Ron calmly sipped his coffee, unbothered. The old man had seen his fair share of bureaucratic nonsense, and this was just another day at the office. She really thinks she can bully us into tearing down a legal ramp, Jake muttered, shaking his head. Ron set his mug down with a deliberate thud. She doesn't think she can. She knows she can, because no one's ever stopped her before. His eyes gleamed. That's where she messed up. Jake ran a hand through his hair. We've got 2 days before she claims we're in violation. That's not a lot of time to fight back. Ron chuckled, pulling out his phone. Good thing I don't need time. I just need a number. He scrolled through his contacts before tapping the screen. The phone barely rang twice before someone picked up. A deep voice rumbled through the speaker. Ron. Been a while. Mike, you still working code enforcement over at City Hall? Still keeping the city in one piece, Mike replied. What's up? Ron leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smile tugging at his lips. Got a situation with an overzealous HOA president who thinks she's above the law. Ever hear of a woman named Karen Simmons? Pause. Then a low chuckle. Oh, her? Yeah, we've had complaints. She's got a history of stretching the rules, but nothing's ever stuck. Ron tapped the table. Well, I've got something that will stick. My grandson built a fully legal ADA-compliant ramp. She's fining him and threatening legal action if he doesn't remove it. Silence on the other end. Then, she's issuing fines for a disability accommodation? Yep. Mike exhaled sharply. That's not just a civil issue, that's an ADA violation. Which means federal involvement. Jake exchanged a glance with his grandfather. I'll need the documentation, Mike continued. Permits, measurements, photos, anything that proves it meets code. If what you're saying checks out, we can put her HOA under official review. I'll have everything to you by noon, Ron said, already reaching for a folder stuffed with blueprints and receipts. As the call ended, Jake let out a slow breath. So what happens now? Ron grinned. Now, we let Karen dig her own grave. By noon, Ron had delivered every piece of paperwork necessary, and the city had officially launched its inquiry. But Karen wasn't the type to back down gracefully. That evening, the HOA called an emergency meeting. The moment Jake wheeled into the clubhouse, he could feel the tension crackling in the air. A dozen board members sat in neat rows, but it was clear who was running the show. Karen stood at the front, a smug smile plastered across her face. Dressed in her signature navy blue power suit, she looked more like a corporate executive than a neighborhood volunteer. Jake rolled up to the front, arms crossed. Got your letter? He said, voice cool. Karen's smile widened. Then I assume you're here to discuss removing the ramp. A murmur ran through the room. Some of the board members shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. Jake's lips curled into a humorless smile. No. I'm here to tell you that you're in violation of federal law. Karen's expression flickered, but she recovered quickly. That's cute, she said. But the HOA has the right to enforce its regulations. Your ramp is a structural modification that was never approved. It was approved, Jake shot back. By the city. Which outranks your HOA. Karen's smile thinned. The city has no jurisdiction over HOA aesthetic policies. That's where you're wrong, a new voice cut in. Heads turned as Mike, the city inspector, walked into the room. The murmurs grew louder. Karen's fingers twitched at her clipboard, but she held her ground. "And who exactly are you?" she asked, masking her irritation with faux politeness. Mike pulled out his badge and held it up for the room to see. "Michael Hayes, City Code Enforcement." His gaze locked onto Karen. "And I'm here because this HOA is under investigation for disability discrimination." A ripple of shock spread through the audience. Karen's smile faltered for real this time. "That's absurd," she scoffed. "This isn't discrimination. It's about maintaining property values." Mike folded his arms. "Property values don't override federal law. Your fine against Mr. Carter is illegal, and if it's not rescinded immediately, the city will be pursuing legal action against you and the HOA. The room went dead silent. Jake could practically see the wheels turning in Karen's head. She was cornered and she knew it. But she wasn't done yet. Her smile returned, but this time it was sharper. "Then we'll change the HOA rules," she said smoothly. "If the current bylaws don't allow us to regulate structures like these, we'll amend them." Mike shook his head. "Doesn't work that way. The Americans with Disabilities Act is federal. No HOA rule can override it." Karen's jaw tightened. "This is outrageous. The HOA has existed for over 20 years without government interference." "This isn't interference," Mike interrupted. "It's accountability." He stepped forward. "I suggest you drop this now before you find yourself in deeper trouble than a fine." Karen's smile vanished. For the first time she looked uncertain. Jake watched her closely, heart pounding. He could see it, the brief flash of panic in her eyes before she masked it with a look of icy disdain. Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and walked out. The moment the door slammed shut behind her, the room erupted. "She can't do that, can she?" one board member whispered. "She's insane," another muttered. Mike turned to Jake. "This isn't over. But she's on thin ice now." Jake exhaled, tension draining from his shoulders. His grandfather clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Told you, kid," he murmured with a grin. "She just dug her own grave." But Jake wasn't so sure. Because something told him Karen wasn't done playing dirty. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat. That much became clear the next morning when Jake found another envelope taped to his door, this time marked urgent. He ripped it open, eyes narrowing at the contents. A revised notice from the HOA, stamped with today's date, now claiming that all exterior modifications, regardless of previous approvals, must undergo new board review. The fine was gone, but the demand remained: remove the ramp or face legal action. Jake let out a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He should have known she wouldn't back off. Karen wasn't just stubborn, she was vindictive. Ron read over his shoulder, chuckling. "So, that's her play? Change the rules mid-game? She thinks if she shifts the goalposts fast enough, we won't be able to catch her," Jake muttered. Ron's grin widened. "Then maybe it's time we really put her on blast." Jake raised a brow and Ron pulled out his phone. "You ever heard the phrase, sunlight is the best disinfectant?" Jake's lips curled into a slow smile. "I like where this is going." That night, Jake posted everything online: the original fine, the threats, the blatant discrimination. A simple caption: *HOA president trying to make me remove my wheelchair ramp. Legal? No. Disgusting? Absolutely. *. Within hours the post exploded. Comments flooded in. *This is illegal. Someone report her. *. Name and shame that HOA. This is straight up evil. *. Imagine being so miserable that you harass a disabled guy over a ramp. By morning, the story had spread beyond his small corner of the internet. News outlets picked it up. Local disability advocates tagged city officials, demanding action. The mayor himself issued a statement condemning HOA overreach. Karen had no idea what was coming. By the time she arrived at the next HOA meeting, the damage was done. Reporters were waiting outside the clubhouse, cameras rolling. Residents who had once feared her now whispered behind her back. She barely made it inside before she was met with the sight of the full board, every seat filled, some members looking downright furious. And at the center of it all was Jake, parked in the front row, arms crossed. Karen cleared her throat, smoothing down her blazer as she took her place at the podium. "I assume we're all here to discuss your resignation." The words came from Greg Hastings, a longtime board member who had never dared challenge her before. Karen's eyes snapped to him, her smile slipping. "I beg your pardon?" Greg set down a stack of papers. "We received a notice from City Hall this morning. We are now under official investigation for multiple ADA violations. He looked directly at her. Your actions have put the entire HOA at risk of a lawsuit. Karen let out a clipped laugh, the kind meant to maintain control when control was slipping fast. This is ridiculous. I followed protocol. You rewrote protocol, another board member snapped. Karen's eyes darted around the room looking for support. She found none. Jake watched, silent and steady, as she struggled to regain ground. He wanted her to feel what he had felt, to realize too late that she had lost. Karen straightened, clearing her throat. We can rectify this. We simply need to issue a clarification on. Greg cut her off. Karen, the damage is done. The HOA's reputation is in the gutter, the city is involved, and homeowners are furious. He tapped his pen on the desk. We took a vote before you arrived. You're out. The words hit like a gunshot. Karen's face paled. You can't. We did, Greg said flatly. Effective immediately. Silence thickened the air. Karen stood there, stiff, her knuckles white against the podium. Then, with slow precision, she picked up her clipboard and tucked it under her arm. You're making a mistake, she said, voice low. No one responded. She turned on her heel and stalked out of the clubhouse, shoving the doors open so hard they slammed against the walls. Jake let out a slow breath, tension finally unraveling from his shoulders. But it wasn't over yet. 2 days later, news broke that Karen's own property was under review. Someone had dug up old records. Her pristine, manicured home had several unapproved modifications, ones that did violate HOA regulations. The irony was delicious. Even better? The internet had turned her into a full-blown meme. A video surfaced of her angrily shoving a news camera away as she tried to dodge reporters. Screenshots circulated with captions. Asterisk, rules are rules. Asterisk, asterisk, the HOA enforcer can't follow HOA rules. Asterisk, asterisk, live by the fine, die by the fine. Asterisk. Jake grinned at his phone, scrolling through the chaos. Ron peered over his shoulder, chuckling. You think she's learned her lesson? Jake smirked. Not a chance. But it didn't matter. Because now everyone was watching. The sun was shining the day Karen's reign officially ended. It was the kind of crisp morning that smelled like fresh-cut grass and new beginnings. Jake sat on his front porch, sipping his coffee as he watched the moving trucks pull up to Karen's house. The once imposing queen of the HOA had been dethroned, and now she was doing the one thing she had probably never planned for, leaving. She stood in her driveway, barking orders at the movers, her perfectly manicured nails slicing through the air as she waved them toward the boxes stacked neatly on the curb. She still had that haughty air about her, that stiff-backed posture that suggested she thought she was better than everyone else. But the difference was now everyone knew she wasn't. Jake took another slow sip of coffee, savoring the moment. It wasn't about gloating, okay, maybe a little, but it was mostly about relief. She was finally gone. The fallout from her actions had been swift and merciless. Once news of her hypocrisy spread, neighbors she had once bullied turned on her without hesitation. The very same people who had been too afraid to speak out before suddenly had stories to tell, how she had fined the Johnsons for leaving their trash cans out 5 minutes too long, how she forced the Millers to repaint their front door twice because she didn't like the shade of blue, how she tried to make the Thompsons get rid of their kids' basketball hoop because it wasn't aesthetically pleasing. It turned out that everyone had been waiting for someone to stand up to her. Jake just happened to be the one who lit the match. The HOA board, desperate to salvage their reputation, had not only removed Karen but issued a formal apology to Jake. The new president, Greg Hastings, had personally come to his house to assure him that his ramp would never be touched again. He even brought a proposal to make the neighborhood more accessible, a move that likely had more to do with covering their legal backsides than genuine goodwill, but Jake would take the win. Karen, on the other hand, had no wins left to claim. She turned abruptly, catching sight of Jake watching from his porch. For a moment, her face twisted, something bitter and sharp flickering in her eyes. Maybe she was searching for a final shred of dignity. Maybe she wanted to say something, some parting shot to reclaim a fraction of her lost power. But there was nothing left to say. She turned away without a word, stepping into the front seat of her sleek black SUV. The door slammed and the engine roared to life. And just like that, she was gone. Jake exhaled, the last of the tension finally bleeding from his muscles. From behind him, the screen door creaked open and Grandpa Ron stepped out, hands tucked into his pockets. He watched the moving trucks for a moment before nodding in satisfaction. Well, he mused, guess she finally found a problem she couldn't find her way out of. Jake chuckled, shaking his head. Karma's got a hell of a way of working things out. Ron smirked. That, or she finally realized what happens when you mess with a Carter. Jake let out a small laugh, but it was true. Karen had picked the wrong fight. Ron wandered over to the ramp, running a hand over the smooth wood, the sturdy railings. He tapped it twice, nodding approvingly. Still standing. Always will be, Jake said firmly. His grandfather's eyes softened, pride evident in his expression. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small brass plaque, holding it out to Jake. Curious, Jake took it, turning it over in his hands. The engraved words made his throat tighten. Built with strength. Stood against fools. Asterisk asterisk. Jake blinked against the sudden sting behind his eyes. You made this. Ron shrugged like it was nothing, but there was emotion in the way he cleared his throat. Figured it deserved a proper marker. Something to remind folks that it's here to stay. Jake swallowed the lump in his throat, gripping the plaque tightly. Then, with a quiet nod, he rolled over to the ramp and carefully screwed it into place. It gleamed in the sunlight, a permanent reminder that some things built with care, things built out of necessity, wouldn't be torn down no matter who tried. From across the street, a few neighbors clapped. A couple of them even cheered. It wasn't loud, nothing dramatic, but it was enough. Enough to know that people were watching. That they cared. Jake smiled, rolling back onto the ramp, letting his hands rest on the wheels of his chair as he took one last look at the street, the house Karen used to control, the neighborhood she could no longer terrorize. He had won. And damn did it feel good.